Hey everybody, this is Mike with Free Roaming Photography, and in this video I'm talking to you about how to start using manual mode. Before we begin, just a quick reminder that I do offer private photography workshops in both Grand Teton and Yellowstone National Parks. So if you'd like some real-world practice while I answer any other photography questions you might have, be sure to check out the link in the description. So jumping right in, what is the big secret with manual mode? To be honest, it's really not that hard, it just takes some practice. And then in terms of how to adjust each setting, that really depends on your camera model. So be sure to look that up because it's not only different between each manufacturer, but also between each model within that manufacturer. And once you do get this down, your shots will be more consistently exposed properly, as well as having more control over what remains in focus and what isn't in focus. And just to jump right in, right off that point that I was just making, the setting that determines how much of a scene stays within focus is one of three settings that are manipulated through manual mode, and this particular one is called aperture. Now, these three settings all interplay with each other to create the exposure, but first we're going to look at the aperture. The actual aperture itself is a small circular opening within the lens that widens and shrinks based on what setting is applied to it. This is done using an arbitrary scale known as the f-stop scale. The scale essentially has two levels that all operate as one full scale. One level starts at the number 1, or as it's called on the scale, f1, while the other starts at f1.4. Each scale will double from the previous value, and essentially that gives you all your options along the f-stop scale, i.e. what you can set your aperture to. Now this is consistent not just with photography, but also film and video. So if you're also interested in creating some video work with your camera, this applies to that as well. So then what exactly does the aperture do? That little opening in the lens is actually determining how much light is getting to the actual camera sensor by opening and closing, determined by the number that you applied to it. So in a nutshell, the wider the opening, the more isolated the focus will be, which is frequently used to pop out a subject from the background. To accomplish this, you'll want to get the aperture as low on that scale as possible, f5.6, f4, or even f2.8, or something in that range, depending on the lens's capabilities. These settings are commonly used by wildlife photographers as well as portrait and wedding photographers to make their subjects pop out from the background and give them a little bit more of a dramatic look. Conversely, the smaller the opening, the more the focus will expand throughout the image. To do that, you'll need to set the aperture to a higher range. I typically shoot for f16 because the further you get from f8 or f11, the more distortion, however slight, you might begin to see around the edges of the photo. And this is because f8 to f11 are almost universally the sweet spot of every lens. It's basically where you're going to get the best quality out of the lens overall. So then why not always shoot there? Well, for one, you won't get those great portraits as mentioned earlier, nor will you be able to potentially capture all the depth that's in the landscape in front of you. So straying from that sweet spot is worth it to get the shot that you want just right. So that was kind of a crash course in aperture, and next I'd like to talk about the ISO. The ISO is a setting that typically starts at the lowest end around 50 or 100 depending on your camera, but like aperture, it will double to give you one scale of options. What ISO specifically controls is the camera's sensitivity to the light that's getting exposed to it from the aperture. In general, you want to stay as close to 100 as possible because otherwise, the higher you go, the more noise will be introduced to the image. So why not just always shoot at 100? In bright sunny days, absolutely always shoot at 100. But it starts to get tricky when you get some clouds rolling in or even lower light such as sunrise or sunset. The reason being is that if your ISO is still at 100 and let's say some large clouds roll in, for example, your shutter speed, which we're about to get to, will be too slow to freeze any moving objects such as leaves on a tree that are blowing in a breeze or an animal walking. So really you only want to push it up on an as needed basis. If it's overcast, for example, you'll want to start at something closer to 400 or 500, but of course that can vary depending on specifics and even time of day. You may find that you even need to turn it up higher if you're facing opposite from sunrise or sunset. In any case, this one can be a little tricky to get down, but it does come to you with practice. In general, just stick to as close to 100 as possible and only increment as needed. Well, how do you know when it's needed? That's where the shutter speed comes in. Your shutter speed will determine how long your camera's sensor is exposed to the amount of light coming in based on the aperture and ISO that you've already dialed in. This can range anywhere from 1/8,000th of a second, depending on your camera, to up to a full 30 seconds. Choosing how long to open up the shutter speed for varies greatly on the intent, the scene, the subject, and anything else that's going on that affects the exposure. So how do you know which one to choose? Fortunately, if you're in standard outdoor lighting situations, the camera's built-in light meter will get you pretty close. And that's sort of the easy modern way to determine your shutter speed. When in doubt, you can always use the f/16 sunny day rule. This says that on a bright and sunny day, if you're outside, you can set your aperture to f/16 and the shutter speed will be the reciprocal of the ISO. So for example, if you have your ISO set at 100, your shutter speed would be 1/100th of a second. If you have your ISO set to 250, your shutter speed would be 1/250th of a second, and so on. So if you have relatively sunny conditions, this is also a good place to start. So overall, these are the basics of manual mode. To sum up, if you're shooting a landscape or something where you want the focus preserved throughout the scene, you're going to want to aim for an aperture of something like f/16. If you want to pop your subject out from the background, go as low as the lens will allow, like f4 or something like that. For ISO, keep it as close to 100 as possible, but if it's getting cloudy or the sun is setting, or it hasn't yet risen significantly, push that ISO up as needed to get the shutter speed you'll need to freeze any breezes or movement. In nearly all of these instances, a tripod is going to be necessary to take advantage of those slower shutter speeds. If you're a human, there's going to be a certain point where the shutter speed will become too slow to handhold the camera. Don't ruin the shot. You'll want a tripod in nearly every situation that's not completely sunny. That's not to say you can't get away without one in many instances, but you'll get better shots consistently by using a tripod in those circumstances. So I hope that helps you out. Remember, if you are visiting Grand Teton or Yellowstone National Parks, I am available for private photography workshops. So I'd love to take you out and teach you this and many more tips and tricks in real world situations and examples. If you'd like more info on that, be sure to check out the link in the description. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video to get lots more content. And if you have any other comments or questions, definitely feel free to leave them down in the comments below. And thank you for watching and happy trails.